Well, hello, everyone. You are watching live here on Breakthrough News and Free Speech TV, special coverage of the Democratic National Convention. 2 nights in a row here. We are here with you tonight. We will be back with you tomorrow. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here alongside my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be alongside you for this special event here during the Democratic National Convention leading up to prime time.
Eugene, it is great to be on with you, and it's my absolute pleasure. And I actually mean that despite the fact that it is 2 a.m. where I'm coming to you from. But this is that important to me that I drank some coffee and did my makeup for a 2 a.m. live stream. So there you have it. Commitment.
I'm sure the viewers are very happy, very excited to see you here. I'm happy to have you here. Thanks for staying up late. And I think the point you're making is 100% correct. This is very important. The Democratic National Convention, really the race here, obviously heating up in a major way. Kamala Harris has replaced Joe Biden, as I'm sure everyone knows. Tim Walz is her vice presidential candidate. He will speak in primetime this evening, August 21st. You can see alongside me, the race is very close. So not only is it an important time, an inflection point for the country in many ways, but it does seem that the switch at the top of the Democratic Party ticket has led to a storming back in the polls for the Democrats under the leadership of Vice President Harris. And you're seeing the battleground polls there, and you can see in almost all of them, it's essentially a coin flip in terms of who potentially could win. It's very close, and certainly what is laid out at the Democratic National Convention in terms of the speeches, in terms of whatever policy that there is presented from all the various candidates, the context of everything swirling around the Democratic Party, in particular the ongoing genocide in Gaza, but also a number of other critically important issues for the Democratic Party base and those who may vote for the Democrats. All of that this week is playing and will continue to play a very significant role in what actually takes place there on November 5th in just a couple of months. And I think, Rania, obviously a lot of people are watching this closely. We'll be watching the next 2 nights to see the potential next vice president, the potential president, and very concerned at the situation the country is facing. I mean, it's one of the things that I think we don't hear a lot about in the mainstream media, but, according to the Census Bureau, we've got just over 147 million people in the United States. 147 million are having at least some trouble meeting their expenses week to week. 37 million are having very significant difficulties making ends meet week to week. You look at things like hunger in this country, which is something that hasn't been talked about really at all in any of the major political contexts. We're allegedly not a country with hunger. Well, I'll tell you, there are 25 million people, actually 25.1 million people in the United States who either often or sometimes did not have enough to eat in the last 7 days. So in the last week, 25 million people went hungry on at least some of the days, and many, about 6.3 million on many of the days that went forward. Obviously, inflation is skyrocketing, even though we have such a conversation going on about inflation being defeated. The cost of housing is up 5.1% as of last year. The cost of electricity is up essentially 5%, 4.9% from where it was last year. Food is up 2.2%, and that's just at the grocery store. If you get food away from home, i.e. if you want to go have a good time with your friends or your family, the cost of that is up 4.1%. There are a range of other points I could make here. I mean, we have between 4.3 to 7.3 million people who need affordable housing desperately. That's the gap you have between the available housing and what's really there. You've got nearly, I'm looking at the stats so I get it right, 4.2 million people who think there's at least somewhat to a very likely chance they'll be evicted or foreclosed on in the next 2 months. So the issues, Rania, obviously are very serious, facing so many people in this country, and that is in addition to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the increasing threat of nuclear war, which the New York Times reported on just yesterday, the U.S. Taking more steps there. I could go on and on. We have mass incarceration. We have so many issues that we'll get into tonight, Rania, but very serious moment, and I think a lot of people are asking themselves, will the Democrats offer any answers to any of these problems I've laid out?
I mean, so far, I have not seen policy proposals. I have seen a lot of empty talk about, and mostly the Democrats are kind of resting on running against Trump, which is what they've been doing since 2016. And this time, look, from a horse race perspective, it was certainly a smart move to replace Biden. And in retrospect, you can kind of see the Democratic strategy was to kind of do that early debate to throw Biden to the wolves, to let him kind of, fall on his own sword, and force him to step down because he looked so incompetent. And the bar was set so low that somebody like Kamala Harris, who's been a pretty invisible vice president for the most part, did not poll very well the last time she ran, was not that popular, now seems like sunshine compared to what they were offering with Biden, that it has definitely boosted some enthusiasm, or a lot of enthusiasm, to the point where you see the polls where they are now. So it certainly is her race to lose in many ways. That said, we're not here to cover just the horse race, because like you mentioned, there's so much that matters that doesn't get discussed, or gets discussed with really, really empty talk and empty promises from this party. And we're going to talk a lot about that. But of course, what's looming over the party is the genocide in Gaza, which this has been a Democratic supported, in many ways led genocide. And of course, they're trying to portray Kamala as somehow different than Joe Biden, but she's not. She is the vice president. So all that said, it we'll have to see like what her speech is going to show tomorrow. But we'd already see a lot of disruptions taking place and a lot of dismissiveness that really mirrors and echoes what we saw by Kamala Harris at that rally in Detroit a couple weeks ago, when she said, I'm speaking, and then the Democrats turned it into a meme. You've got AOC having spoken and trying to really run cover for the Democratic Party, and using this, ceasefire rhetoric to try to act as though they're trying to stop a genocide that they are arming, and they refuse to stop arming. So it's all really, really outrageous. And you had Biden speak and try to both sides the issue, saying, yeah, protesters are angry and they have a reason, but, people are dying on both sides, as though that's supposed to, acknowledge the Palestinian suffering. When what both sides are you talking about? One side is literally genociding another side. So anyways, lots of outrage to go around on that. And I know, I'm not trying to talk just exclusively about Gaza, because a lot of this connects to the kind of sort of empty rhetoric you hear from Democrats, or don't hear them even discussing a lot of the issues you just mentioned.
No, I think, you're right to highlight Gaza, because, of course, it's going to be one of the most critical issues in terms of turnout in many of the critical areas. I mean, of course, there's a lot of conversation about Michigan, where, as you saw earlier, the race is certainly close in Michigan now as it is. I mean, Kamala Harris having a slight lead, I think, in most of the polls there. But we saw, I think, over 100-some thousand people vote for Uncommitted there. So how many of those individuals will we see turn out for the Democrats? I mean, we know that there's polling from some Arab American organizations that polled Arabs and Palestinians and had Jill Stein leading Kamala Harris. Jill Stein, the third party candidate, the Green Party candidate. And obviously the biggest issue there is the genocide. So I think that this is really, as you say, the issue that's hanging over the convention, because it is the biggest sort of open question. I mean, I think the New York Times ran the article that said the Democrats' unity convention has one big exception, and that being Palestine. So I think it's playing a major role. And I think, solutions that meet the scale of the problem in general is the question. I think a lot of people who are maybe not Democratic partisans, but who maybe are turned off by President Trump, but are looking towards the Democrats, and they're wondering, do you have these solutions? I mean, obviously Kamala Harris talking about she's going to address grocery prices. And I mentioned the cost of that up 2.2% year on year as of this month. But, not a lot of details about what they're actually going to do. It seems that the plan from the Harris campaign is hewing close to a bill that Elizabeth Warren and others introduced, which is not price controls. Obviously the Republicans have turned this whole meme communism, saying that she's going to cap prices. But the actual proposal is just to allow the government to essentially study people who may be price gouging, and then to bring a legal case against them through the FTC, which, the AP article actually that was about this said, will this plan actually bring down grocery prices? And the first sentence is, experts say no. Now, of course, you can never know what's going to happen in the future. But again, I mean, these are major issues, and they're very serious, and we're getting a lot of lip service from the Democrats and also from the Republicans, who, of course, put inflation front and center, but we're not getting a lot of specifics, as it were. But I think there's a lot to cover, a lot to talk about here, a lot for us to get into. We'll get into as much as we can from 7 to 9 p.m. here tonight. And don't forget, we will also be with you tomorrow. You are watching live here on Breakthrough News and Free Speech TV, special coverage of the Democratic National Convention. And we also have a team on the ground in Chicago that's been there for the past several days, and we'll be bringing you content from them as well. Shout out to Kei Pritsker of Breakthrough News, who many of you know. Also Craig, who is out there, our team, doing great work. So we'll have a lot to bring you from that. But we're also going to have great guests and a great panel of people on both days. And let's go ahead and turn to some of our panelists here tonight. Right now, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Davon Love, who is the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and Amanda Yee, who is the host of the China Report on Breakthrough News and also the editor of Liberation News. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Well, look, it's an honor. Davon, I'll start with you here. I think one of the things that we've been noticing quite a bit here, I think a number of us, is we've seen a lot of spectacle that seems to be aimed at interjecting a level of blackness, if you will, into the convention, I guess, to speak to. So we saw Lil Jon last night, DJ Cassidy, all the various different songs and things that have come to the forefront. And I'm just wondering how that's striking you. I mean, my personal feeling is it seems a little bit like there's a lot of spectacle to cover up that maybe there's a little less substance, but that's just my editorial. I wonder what you think of what we've seen the first couple days here on that front or any other.
So I'll say two things. First is that in many ways, one of the problems with the Democratic Party, particularly in its way that it interacts with Black people, there's a way that it is infantilizing and paternalistic. That there's this notion that, if you infuse some pop culture, that is a appropriate substitute for politics. And so that's kind of the first thought. It's just kind of frustrating, the kind of infantilization that I think that many folks within the Democratic Party, Black folks in the Democratic Party, welcome in ways that I think is just kind of, paternalistic and really insulting the intelligence of the average Black voter. Lil Jon is not going to make a person vote who wasn't already going to vote, right? So that's the first thing. The second and more kind of substantive observation, one of the things that for me, and I've said this on the show before, when you think about the American political system, right? I'm clear it's a white supremacist, imperialist, heteropatriarchal capitalist society. And that's not incidental to America. That's foundational to what America is. And both parties being just different wings of that same kind of imperial white supremacist machine. And looking at, so we should not expect to get anything substantive from the speeches at the DNC, right? But particularly as it relates to Black people, one of the things that I think is a tool that the Democratic Party uses in order to maintain the relationship that it has, particularly to Black folks in the United States, is that there's a sort of kind of political hostage holding where, in terms of the kind of power that Black folks would need to exercise the kind of sovereignty and self-determination that would naturally lend itself to more substantive aspects of our concerns being addressed, right? What ends up happening is that folks' theory of change that is, portrayed to us through the DNC and through the speeches, the theory of change is that if one just, believes enough in the system and buys in to the kind of spectacles that you mentioned, that becomes a substitute for politics. And part of what the effect that has is that it drowns out. And I want to go back to even where you started, Eugene, when you gave like some of the social scientific data that substantiates the extent of the suffering, right, of, poor people in general, but that many Black people are overrepresented, right, in those numbers that you talked about. So there's a way that part of what the function of the spectacle is to take people's attention off of the way that there is immense suffering on the masses of Black people in the United States, and that this becomes a way to hide that suffering in order to justify a theory of change that, again, suggests that you have enough Black faces in high places, that is a substitute for the kind of politics that's about changing the fundamental aspect of the system.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to what you just described, it applies to so much. I mean, when you talk about imperialism, one thing I find so striking about the American elections, especially watching it from abroad, is how so much of the world is impacted by the elections in the US, but they have no say because the US is this dictator of the world. And most people in the US, especially those who get, the most attention when it comes to trying to grab voters, because, when they're trying to appeal to voters, they're trying to appeal, the Democrats and Republicans are trying to appeal to a very specific type of voter. They're trying to appeal to like the Midwestern, swing voter, like middle-class whites. Especially Democrats are always trying to peel off those suburban middle class, upper middle class, Midwestern white people. So it's just, there's all these people around the world that kind of watch in anticipation and a bit nervously, sort of knowing that things aren't going to change too much no matter who's in charge, but also still quite frightened about what's going to befall their country, depending on who ends up being elected. And so actually from your perspective, Amanda, I'm curious how you see that issue that I just described, especially as you cover Cold War issues a lot with the US escalating Cold War with China. And that's something else. Like if I were a massive country like China, any of the surrounding countries of China, I would be looking to see, is either candidate necessarily better? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure you could speak to that. But also, I'd be maybe a little bit quite frightened about the one specifically who accused China of raping the U.S. economy the last time he ran for president. But regardless, I'm just curious what you have to say about that thought.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's really hard to say because, Kamala Harris, despite running for president right now, she doesn't really have a policy platform on her campaign page. So you can't really say much about her foreign policy other than, you can just make the assumption that it's just going to be a continuation of Biden's current foreign policy. And I mean, Biden's current foreign policy on China has been really, really terrible. And, I assume that under Kamala Harris, we're going to see just a continuation of that. We're going to see the further tightening of export controls, the furthering of military encirclement of China. We're probably going to see more funding to arm Taiwan. The issue being that Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company is the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer. And they produce, I think, over 90% of advanced chip manufacturing in 2022. And so, the US has been trying to block China's access to these chips and this chip making technology because it's really these chips that are vital to China's technological and economic development, right? And so China sees Taiwan's proximity, or the US sees Taiwan's proximity to China as this kind of strategic vulnerability. And so we can sort of expect under a Kamala Harris administration, sort of the continuation of sanctions on things like semiconductors, continuation of tariffs on things like EVs to keep them out of the US market because, frankly, China produces a better product and the US can't really compete with that, right? And so all of this is just like a continuation of an escalation of the war drive on China, which Trump, of course, participated in, he engaged with, but Biden continued under his administration. And I think, one of the more alarming things that Harris will likely inherit is this NATO plan to pivot to Asia, right? A few weeks ago, NATO held their annual summit in Washington, D.C. And one of the key takeaways that came out of that is that basically NATO is pivoting to the Pacific. Namely to confront China, right? So what does that mean? It means that NATO is going to expand its partnerships into the Indo-Pacific, which means it's going to increase the military buildup surrounding China. And so NATO and the US are also going to seek to institutionalize the partnerships of what they call the Indo-Pacific Four, which includes Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. And they're going to move toward the creation of an Asian NATO to counter North Korea and China. And so these are the kinds of policies that Kamala Harris is going to inherit. They're very dangerous policies. They're policies that are going to push us into a military confrontation with China, possibly into a nuclear conflict. Watching the last 2 days of the DNC, you basically had no idea that that's going on. It was just basically a kind of event to rewrite the history or rewrite the legacy of Joe Biden and rewrite the legacy and the policies of Kamala Harris. And whatever policies that they talked about, they didn't even touch the most important ones, I feel like. They didn't touch Gaza. They didn't touch China. They just had very vague, very vague things to say about how pro-worker Kamala Harris is and, how much she cares about the middle class, which is all a joke, and it just shows you that the Democratic Party has nothing to offer. They are just another capitalist party that's driving us to war.
Well, a lot of great points there initially, and I think a lot of the points that you all have raised are what have led to there being protest, pretty consistently from the very beginning of the Democratic National Convention here in Chicago this week. We're going to be back with our panel in just a second to dig deeper into a lot of things, but we want to bring you a report from Breakthrough News' Kei Pritsker, who is there on Monday at one of the larger protests on the opening day of the DNC, and some of what he and our team were able to capture from those who are there to oppose what is happening inside of the United Center. And anyway, we'll come back with some responses on that and continue to dig into all these critical issues floating around the DNC and the election.
So today is Monday. It's the first day of the Democratic National Convention where Kamala Harris will be nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate. But what you see behind me is not the DNC. It is thousands of people who have gathered here to protest the DNC. And, there's a lot of anger here today. There's a lot of anger around the presidential ticket, particularly around the genocide that's happening in Palestine and Kamala Harris's support for it. We've spoken to a lot of people who have been sort of moved to come here from as far as Nebraska. We talked to someone from Nebraska. We talked to other people from Idaho, from all over the country who are coming here to protest what they see as, not just what they're calling the genocide convention, but also a very undemocratic process. Obviously, Kamala Harris was sort of swept in there last minute, despite all the concerns about her popularity, about obviously the baggage of supporting a genocide, among other things, her records being so-called tough-on-crime candidate as a prosecutor in San Francisco. All these things raise a lot of legitimate concerns, yet the Democratic Party is going forward, not listening to anyone in its base to nominate Kamala Harris. So, I think a lot of people were wondering what the effect of Joe Biden stepping out of the race would be and, whether or not it would have a sort of galvanizing effect. People were talking about how, I'm coconut pilled, this, that, and the other. But, it feels like a lot of that has worn off, and it feels like there's a lot of anger and frustration here at the Democratic National Convention this year. And today's just the first day. There are protests planned every single day throughout the week. Last night, there was a protest outside one of the hotels where delegates are thought to be staying. I talked to someone, they told me that there were about 5,000 people just screaming, saying, shame on you for going forward and nominating this candidate who, not only supports a genocide, but is backed by Wall Street, is backed by corporations like Uber and BlackRock are some of her top advisors. So, we'll see how it plays out. There's a massive police presence here. That's the other thing. There's a massive police presence. A lot of the city is on lockdown. Even more so than in usual convention years. But we'll be following all of the protests that happen throughout the week. And, of course, Thursday, we expect a big turnout because Kamala Harris herself will be speaking. But, we're going to go around this demonstration today and talk to some people and ask them why they came out to protest the DNC. Why do you feel it's important to protest the DNC?
It's important because I think a lot of people are pretty fed up with the two-party system as it is right now. We are being, forced to choose between like a racist reactionary like Donald Trump, but then we have like either, Biden or Kamala, or, a lot of other Democratic figures, unfortunately, are pro-genocide, to be blunt about it. So, we want to show that we're not happy and we don't want to take this.
So you came 7 hours to protest this DNC. Why do you think it's so important?
Well, I'm a registered Democrat, and I've been a registered Democrat since 2016, and I think it's really important to get my voice heard in front of my party, in front of the people that I thought were going to listen to me, but have funded this genocide for the last 11 months. That's why I'm here, to get my voice heard, let them know that we do not support this violence, support the genocide that they're supporting right now. And yeah, we're here to tell them that all Democrats are not like you. We're on the right side of history, and we want to be on the right side of history. So
now the United States, whose ruling party is the Democratic Party at the moment, is funding a genocide of primarily Muslim people in Gaza. So I'm here to speak out against that, to say and acknowledge the fact that this genocide that is happening in Gaza against the Palestinian people could not be happening without the support of the Democratic Party.
We have to fight. We have to fight for a better world, because these politicians will never, ever give us anything out of the goodness of their hearts. And that's why we have over 270 organizations united in this coalition and ready to fight every day until we destroy this genocidal system.
I mean, we need a ceasefire now. Like right now, not November 4th, not November 5th, not the day after the election in some turn of events, right? Now is when we need the ceasefire. And Kamala Harris is a vice president. She can work with President Biden on effecting that ceasefire now.
And would you say that's the consensus feeling among most Arabs and Palestinians in Minnesota?
Based on my conversations, certainly.
We're at the front of the march now, getting ready to kick off. There are about 270 organizations that are involved in putting this march together. They're not going to get very close. The stopping point of the march is 2 miles away, because the city has actually sued the march and has basically been trying to shut down the march by controlling the march route. They're saying that they can't bring sound on the march, so people aren't going to be able to hear the chants. They also controlled the amount of porta potties, the amount of bathrooms that could be at at the rally here. So it's really just like blatant suppression of speech. They're trying to make sure that this rally doesn't go forward, but it's going forward anyway, as you can see. So what brought you out here?
Because it's time for change. And the DNC, we need to let them know our demands and what we're fighting for. A lot of stuff with mass incarceration, that's what I fight for a lot.
The Democrats try to sell themselves as the party of like, we're for racial justice. We don't want to imprison people.
No, they're part of the problem. They're part of the problem. Republicans and Democrats are part of the problem. I think we need a whole new party, honestly. It's all the same. Every year is the same. Even when I stayed in the red, it was the same. That's why I say it needs to be just a new party that's bipartisan to what everybody says, and do what the people say independently.
So what made you come out here today?
I think the reason I came out is because the Democrats have failed us time and time again, claiming to be progressives when they don't actually fight for any progressive values.
And, as someone, you live in Chicago, you said?
Yes.
Okay. As someone living in Chicago, Democratic city, Democratic politicians, how is Democratic rule in this city? What has it meant for working people here?
Yeah, I think the contradictions are extremely heightened in Chicago, given that it is a Democratic city, but we're the most segregated city in the U.S. We have obviously a high homeless population, and we see the most police violence in the country against brown and black people. So I think having Democrats in power obviously does not solve any of these issues, and everyone here agrees that there needs to be another solution.
So right now we're at the security barrier. So this is as close as you can actually get to the United Center, which you see behind me. It's that great building. This is as close as they're letting the protests get to the DNC, which is inside over there. And you can see they put up the anti-climb fences with concrete barriers behind. You see cops all around. So this is as close as they'll let them get, 2 miles away from the United Center. So we're at the security barrier now. We're at least a mile away from the DNC. Why do you think they're trying to prevent this protest from getting close to the venue?
I mean, cynically, they don't want to hear from us. They want to keep us away. They want to have a celebration. They don't want to hear our voices. But Kamala, we're trying to help you. We want to help you. A lot of people here don't want to vote for you. I'm going to vote for you. You're making it really hard for me to motivate other people to vote for you. That's what I'm here for. It's a strategic thing to do. It's the right thing to do.
So you actually support her, but you feel disgusted by what she's doing right now.
Of course I do. Killing kids is not okay. She's better than Trump, but that's not good enough. And it's making it hard for me to convince other people of that.
And what would be your message to the delegates inside who are nominating her right now? Would you like to see them say, like, carry this message inside the convention?
I want Kamala to come out here and join us.
So, as you can see, the protesters have just broken the security barrier outside the DNC. They're hopping the fence. There's another barrier, a different type of barrier on the other side, and there's a line of cops. And as you can see above, the police are watching. They have a police helicopter. So they're keeping a close eye on the protest, but, you know, people are obviously angry. I'm not sure they'll get close, but we're going to stick with this and see what happens. But this is, you know, obviously the DNC was afraid of the protest getting too close, reaching delegates, you know, shaming them and sort of telling them that they're supporting a genocidal candidate. And that's exactly what these protesters are trying to do. They're saying that the people inside are the war criminals. They're supporting a war criminal, that they should be allowed to do this. It's their right to protest, and that they shouldn't be treated like criminals for protesting this genocide.
Well, that was Breakthrough News' Kei Pritsker on the ground in Chicago at the opening day protest, bringing some color there from those who were out there protesting the DNC. You are watching live coverage, special coverage of the DNC on Breakthrough News and Free Speech TV. We continue to be joined by Davon Love and Amanda Yee. Davon, I'll start with you again. Anything that pops out to you about what people are saying? And maybe another question I have for you, in addition to any reflections you have, is the relationship of protest to politics and the relationship of protest movements to political campaigns.
So I think that what is clear, and I think even people that do not share the kind of radical political sensibilities that people represent in this conversation, I think the average person is becoming more aware of the futility of a two-party system, particularly this two-party system, and being able to deliver anything but recapitulations to the status quo. Right. So I think that's something that is an emerging consciousness. And so I think the question is then, how do we direct people to navigate the political arena in a way that is informed by that fundamental principle? So I think a lot of like the reporting that we just heard, I think is reflective of that raising consciousness. So what I would want to add to that is that there needs to be an understanding of like how to navigate the political arena in a way that both maintains the integrity of radical politics while also acknowledges the existing landscape that we're having to navigate, right? So, for instance, I think there's a question about, do we focus on, alternative parties, like, parties other than the Democratic Republican Party? I think that's important. I think that there are, important efforts, around the country where folks are trying to elect people outside of the traditional two-party system. Right. So I think that's one thing that I think is important for folks to think about and trying to go beyond the duopoly is what are things locally folks can do, even if it's not running a candidate that can win. Because I think too often people perceive votes for Republican Democrat parties, Green Party, PSL, other parties, they see them as protest votes. But I think it's important for us to help people understand that there's actually political utility. And an example of what that political utility is that one of the things that I've experienced in Maryland, right, in Baltimore, is that having candidates to the left of the Democratic Party, where Democratic Party stronghold, right, having candidates run to the left of where the Democratic Party is, in significant enough numbers that people who are running for office will see it. Folks who have run campaigns, There's, software databases where they log, people's voting records. So having substantial numbers of people vote, in the instance that I'm describing for the Green Party, right? And you don't necessarily have to subscribe to all of the tenets of the Green Party, right? But it's certainly left of the Democratic Party. And so one of the things that we did, right, was that we supported Green Party candidates that we knew likely weren't going to win. But what that did is that the substantial numbers of people who voted for those Green Party candidates set a tone where other people who would run for office in the Democratic Party would move further to the left in order to capture the electorate of those significant numbers, not enough to win, but significant enough numbers that would impact the election. So then going to your question in terms of the role of protests, I think, the role of protests is to highlight not just the contradictions, right, in the system or heighten the consciousness of those contradictions. But I think what protests also do is it helps to put pressure, right, on the system. So because one of the things that you may hear from folks who are within the system, whose worldview is one that is more connected and committed to the status quo, is many of them may give examples of some of the good things that their party has done, right? Or some of the good things that folks have been able to do. And so it's important to have protests to contrast the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, there are millions of people who are suffering under the existing system that is not negated by one or a few examples of good things that the party was able to do. Right. And so again, I think, one of the things in terms of landing this point is to say that, we need to, I think, and I'm appreciative of this platform, to be able to have sophisticated conversations about how we do the work outside of the context of the Democratic Party to build alternatives while at the same time navigating the existing political terrain in order to be able to get as many concessions as we can get in order to move the ball forward in terms of improving the material conditions of people.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. And, one thing that stood out to me from that report, too, in relation to the issue of protests, is just how policed these kinds of protests are. And I've been to the DNC before, and I remember it was in 2016 when a lot of the protest was related to the fact that Bernie Sanders was pushed out and Hillary Clinton was the nominee, and it was seen as very unfair, and people were very much against Hillary Clinton's very right-wing policies. And there was a lot of protests inside the DNC from delegates, and there was so much emphasis on trying to make a sort of barrier or maybe buffer zone, if you will, to try to prevent protests from even coming anywhere near the convention. And you see something similar happening this time around as well, as they really don't want to have to see protesters. Like the way that Kei was showing, where it's like not even near the convention center. So it's like they've tried to immunize themselves from protesters on the one hand. Also, I saw reports, before we were going live, about the fact that a Palestinian speaker, like the Uncommitted movement was trying to get a Palestinian speaker on the speakers list, and the DNC has been completely unreceptive to that, while of course having, I think, like the Israeli hostage family or something speaking. So all that said, Amanda, I'm curious your thoughts on all that, and also the fact that when it comes down to it, the Democrats are just as supportive of Israel as the Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I think your comparison to the DNC protests when they kind of, blocked out Bernie Sanders is really apt. And I think both times it just shows you how out of touch the Democrats are with their base, right? A majority of Americans support a ceasefire, and a majority of Americans support ending any kind of aid to Israel, and a majority of Democratic voters support ending aid to Israel. And I think, what a slap in the face it is to these voters that there are thousands of protesters outside of the DNC protesting, and Gaza barely gets any sort of mention during the convention at all, right? I watched the first 2 days, speaker after speaker, hardly anyone mentioned Gaza. AOC kind of briefly mentioned about Kamala Harris tirelessly fighting for a ceasefire, maybe as a bone to throw to her progressive supporters. I think Bernie Sanders might have mentioned it. Joe Biden talked about it a little bit. But those were really the only people that I remember talking about it. And it's really interesting because Gaza is really the issue that sunk Biden's campaign, right? For months, ever since October 7th, Biden's numbers were steadily sinking because of the genocide that was going on and because of his policy to just continually send more and more weapons to Israel. And so it was these protests in the streets that kept the issue of Gaza alive in the public consciousness. And at the same time, this uncommitted movement was growing. And so by a really terrible debate performance against Trump, and I think the Democrats just used that as an excuse to kind of push him aside in favor of Kamala Harris. But I think Gaza at the same time, this is the issue that we have to be really cautious about when it comes to Harris, because this is the issue. This is the one area where the Democrats are really trying to distinguish her from Biden. Ever since she became the presumptive nominee, there's been this concerted effort to paint her as somehow more sympathetic to Gaza. They keep saying that she was the first one in the Biden administration to call for a ceasefire. At one point, I think she described Israel's genocide in Gaza as a humanitarian catastrophe, which it is. But at the same time, there's really no indication that her policy toward Gaza is really going to change, And I think a better window into what her actual Gaza policy would look like is how she responded to the July 24th protests in DC. It was a protest where thousands of people were demonstrating against Netanyahu's address to Congress. There was heavy police repression. Protesters were being pepper sprayed by cops, as Eugene, very well. And after a day, like the next day, she released a statement calling the protests despicable and anti-Semitic. So this statement was a full-throated condemnation of the protesters, but it had nothing to say about Netanyahu coming to Washington to justify the slaughter in Gaza. It had nothing to say about Netanyahu shamelessly demanding more weapons to send in order to continue his genocide on the Palestinian people. And this entire convention has been one big attempt to ignore the elephant in the room, which is Gaza. And it's just a complete slap in the face to the Democratic base, who all support the end of the genocide and support ending these arms shipments to Israel.
Well, Davon, do you want to jump back in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just 90 seconds to say just two quick things. One thing I want to say is that, and I don't think anyone who spoke did what I'm about to say, but I just wanted to say it for your viewers. I think what the Democratic Party is doing, we should all expect that everything they're doing, we should expect. The police presence, the attempts to ignore the issue, and that the Democratic Party will not be fundamentally changed no matter how much effort people put into it. Right. So I want to say that because as we think about some of the strategies to press the Democratic Party, they will only do what they are made to do. And then the second point that I want to make is that I think it's important for those of us, whether it's the protesters or those of us in our own ways that have pushed publicly against the policy of the Biden administration and the United States policy to Israel and the genocide in Gaza, to give credit that the fact that even though much of whatever mentions of it, they would like to not mention it at all. But they are feeling the pressure, the Uncommitted movement, again, much of the other work that's being done, that there is pressure felt to at least appease people on the issue that I think then has created space politically for more opportunities to do more substantive political work. So for me, that's just important to say, because it's important for people to know that the protests and the pushing that people are doing against the policy, again, even though it isn't having an impact on the policy itself, it has created an environment where the Democrats feel the need to try to respond to it. That's why you get an AOC. up on stage. And I imagine she got a lot in exchange to go up there and represent the administration, but they needed that. And I think that should be a sign that the pressure is having an impact on the Democratic Party.
No, extraordinarily important points, extraordinarily important points. And, you know, one of the other issues that, of course, is coming to the forefront here in the election, and, of course, with the ascension of Kamala Harris to the top of the ticket, is her own record as the district attorney of San Francisco, the attorney general of the state of California, and, of course, even as a part of the Biden-Harris administration, as it concerns the criminal legal system, mass incarceration, policing, all those different pieces. We were able to catch up a little bit ago, several days ago, with Alec Karakatsanis, who's a civil rights attorney, former public defender, and the founder of the Civil Rights Corps, to talk a little bit about Kamala's legacy on this point. So we want to go to this interview we were able to do a few days ago with Alec. We'll be back with our panel on this and many more issues right after that. And we are very, very honored to be joined here as we continue the show by Alec Karakatsanis, who's a civil rights attorney, former public defender, and founder of the Civil Rights Corps. Alec, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here, and obviously in the context of everything with the DNC, one of the biggest issues for the Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, is her previous record as District Attorney of San Francisco and also Attorney General of the state of California. And obviously going back to 2020 when she ran for president the first time, you know, this has been an issue of how to classify her. I think a lot of people are saying it's a contradictory record. You know, in her book, she's held herself out as a progressive prosecutor. Others are saying that that is not the case. So, I mean, in terms of, you know, maybe the discourse, if you will, around the criminal legal system and the desire of millions of people to see an end to the era of mass incarceration, is there a clean way to fit Kamala Harris into these various boxes?
I think I want to just first start by saying that in this moment of rising authoritarianism, it is absolutely vital that we speak the truth as we see it. And only by speaking the truth and relentlessly speaking the truth about things like Kamala Harris's prior role in the system of mass human caging and the profiteering off of mass human caging, only by speaking that truth can we actually have an understanding as a society of what kinds of policies are harmful and destroying people and their families and the communities, and how we might, as a movement, put pressure on people in power to change those things. So when I tell the truth about my own experiences with Kamala Harris and what I've observed in my career, I'm doing it in the spirit of combating what I think is a very, very dangerous and threatening push to increase surveillance, to increase imprisonment, to increase punishment, to increase the profit off of all these systems. So when I first encountered Kamala Harris, she was running from the right in an attempt to take power as the district attorney of San Francisco on a platform of being harsher on poor people, Black people, people of color, immigrants than her predecessors, right? And when she took over in San Francisco, she had an unbroken record for many years of doing things like using the cash bail system to coerce people into pleading guilty when they were illegally detained. She had a very, very pro punishment, pro imprisonment, pro family separation record as DA, where she increased felony prosecutions over her predecessors, et cetera. This same pattern was still the way she conducted herself when she became California Attorney General. And I wrote in my book in much more length about Harris's kind of grotesque comments about punishing poor parents through human caging for the truancy of their children, her comments about the need to maintain a profitable labor force of slave prison labor to fight fires in California, you know, on and on and on. Her stance against the death penalty and her stance fighting those cases, including cases with egregious prosecutor misconduct that Laura Bazelon, the professor in California, has written about extensively publicly. There's a long and documented record of Harris taking some of the most monstrous decisions that are imaginable in the punishment bureaucracy. We can't shy away from that, because I think the proper way to evaluate someone like Harris on the criminal punishment system is that she's sort of an empty vessel. Her career sort of shows, including when she started to talk more progressively in 2020, that she's willing to sort of do what she thinks politically expedient. So that can include taking grotesque positions and destroying people's lives, but could also include talking really differently about the need to change these systems. And I think the common thread is doing what she thinks is politically expedient for herself. So I think the most important thing with someone like Harris is we need to build power as a movement, because I think she's going to respond to power and what's in her own interest.
No, I think those are very well taken points. And just to pick up on a couple of the things that you mentioned there, it's the issue of the, slave labor in prisons, which I think is an important issue. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe this was an issue that cropped up for her after there were a number of court rulings that the massive overcrowding of the facilities there in California were violating people's constitutional rights, and the size of the prison population had to be, reduced. And that was essentially her response in fighting against attempts to, let a significant number of people out because they were suffering from cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah, I mean, I think she literally said, at the time that, quote, if we release people from these overcrowded and horrific conditions, that the prisons would lose an important labor pool. That was her quote. And, people at the time, I think in California, the prison slave labor industry was paying prisoners about $1.45 a day to fight some of the most dangerous wildfires imaginable. And that was Harris's reaction. And that is some glimpse into what she is capable of as a person and as a leader. But on the other hand, in the post-2020 era, she started reframing her public image as a sort of progressive who was sort of on the front lines of the mainstream Democratic establishment's response to the George Floyd protests. So I think what we're seeing is someone who's willing to sort of do whatever it takes in the moment. And I think that's why it's always so important for people who care about marginalized communities, who care about human caging, who care about family separation, who care about public health and safety, to build power amongst ourselves so that we can hold people like Harris accountable.
No, I think that's a really important point. And I think in terms of how we message this for people and the way it's really messaged in the campaign vis-a-vis the issue of public safety is that there's sort of a direct equal sign, like even if the police are not always good, even if the prisons are not always good, that to some degree, public safety is policing prisons, long sentences, even if it's just for the tough offenders. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and that sort of overall framing about what it means to actually have public safety and what we know about many of these policies that are pushed as public safety, but I think, well, I won't editorialize too much. Maybe that's not really the case.
I think one thing that you don't see a lot in the mainstream news is the actual evidence about mass human caging in the US. So we are now putting Black people in cages at 6 times the rate of South Africa at the height of apartheid. We are putting all human beings in cages in this country at a rate 5 to 10 times other comparably wealthy countries. What does that mean? There's been some fantastic new research out in the last few years that shows that the overall total US life expectancy for all of us is about 2 years shorter than it would be if we were jailing people at the rates of other comparable countries or our own history. So what we're talking about with these mass human caging policies is not only do they not keep us safe, but they actually reduce overall US life expectancy by hundreds of millions of years. We're talking about catastrophic harm that is not reported in any meaningful and reasonable way in the mainstream media. So whether you're talking about Harris's prior support for the drug war or Harris's prior support for locking people up for committing crimes of poverty, you're actually talking about policies that have been widely and roundly discredited by the overwhelming evidence.
Well, to pick up on one interesting point that I think you're making here about Harris being kind of an empty vessel in some ways. Now, of course, a big deal is being made by, many on the Republican side of things about Tim Walz and his potential role or what it was vis-a-vis the George Floyd uprising there in Minneapolis. But, I think it may be an interesting factor here because, as you're pointing out, it was the George Floyd protest that changed a lot of people's tune on what they were saying and what they were promoting in the context of the 2020 election. So it's almost like there's a paradox here that it's being used and weaponized in a way to make it seem like, the Harris-Walz ticket is X, Y, and Z in terms of lawlessness and so on and so forth, but that there's perhaps a lesson that these mass movements are teaching us about how change is really made.
Yeah, I think what mass movements like the protest movement did was they changed consciousness at a really deep, profound, emotional level for lots of people. And they changed how people think about the punishment bureaucracy. People started paying attention to the fact that there are over 400,000 human beings right now, as you and I are talking, who are in a cage, separated from their children, from their parents, unable to hug each other, to kiss each other on the forehead, kiss goodnight like we all take for granted from our loved ones, etc. 400,000 people solely because they lack cash to buy their own release. And when people started becoming aware of those things on a more systemic and emotional level in 2020, people like Harris then immediately pivoted, and all of a sudden Harris became an opponent of cash bail, the very policy she had used for years and years to crush people. That's the power of mass movements. You can take a person like Harris, who obviously was never moved throughout the course of her career to care about the issue of family separation and cash bail, to become all of a sudden a leading federal legislative opponent of cash bail. That's the power of social movements. But now we've seen sort of a reactionary backlash since 2020, and the zeitgeist is much more authoritarian and more punitive, at least in the Democratic establishment circles. And so we're seeing Harris do things like call for more border guards to arrest and jail and separate more families. These are Trump-like policies, right? And she's doing this in the face of incredible evidence from around the world. There's an amazing study from Oxford University last year that showed that political parties like the Democrats and other liberal political parties in Europe, when they take or attempt to take more far-right stances on things like immigration and punishment, they actually lose ground electorally because it seems inauthentic. And if people really are persuaded by the message that immigrants are the danger to our society and poor people who are committing crimes are sort of the biggest risk to our safety, they're not going to vote for the Democrat. They're going to more likely vote for the more authoritarian, genuine article. So it's actually a bad electoral strategy, according to all the research that we have. And so that's why it's very, very important for people of goodwill who care about authoritarianism, who care about democratic participation, who care about health and safety and wellness for all human beings to flourish, to relentlessly speak the truth about what these policies do, who they benefit, and who they harm.
You know, just one thing before we let you go here that I think is also on this sort of broader piece, maybe just the broader framing of the electoral conversation too, as well as, I mean, is the perception that we are in the midst of a crime wave, which I think to some degree very much determines how people are orienting towards it. I mean, is this in and of itself, you know, a part and parcel of a broader attempt to misdirect people about what really is happening and thus what we really need to do to address public safety?
Absolutely. And this is a huge theme of my forthcoming book called Propaganda, where I really talk about these crime waves. And there's a lot to say. So, you know, I can only say something very briefly on it now. But for most of the last 20 years, the public opinion polling has shown that people actually think crime has been rising from the prior year. And for almost every year of the last 25 years, crime has been declining. And one thing that's really interesting about those polls is when you ask people about crime generally in the US, they are much more likely to think that crime is rising. But when you ask them about crime in their own neighborhood, they're much more likely to think crime is not rising. When people's perceptions of crime are more based on their own experience, they are less susceptible to fear-mongering. People are hearing what's being said in the media and assuming that crime must be worse everywhere else. And this is a profound problem, right? Because if you look at the actual crime data, we are at near historic lows of all kinds of police-reported crime. And another really, really important point is when we talk about crime rates and when you hear in the media crime waves, these are a very narrow category of crimes that the police choose to record and report to the public. Those crime rates and crime waves do not include things like wage theft, foreclosure fraud, mortgage fraud, air pollution, water pollution by large corporations, building safety code violations by employers and landlords, child labor violations, you name it, right? When law enforcement reports on crime waves, they're only talking about some crimes committed by some people, some of the time in some places. And those typically tend to be crimes committed by people without any power, poor people, people of color, Black people in particular, immigrants, et cetera. And that's something you really have to understand when you're talking about the kind of crime wave that's generated in the news media.
Well, we are very much looking forward to that forthcoming book, Propaganda. And we want to thank you so much, Alec, for joining us on this special broadcast of Breakthrough News, Free Speech TV, and Act TV for the DNC.
Thank you so much.
And we are still here with you live on Breakthrough News and Free Speech TV with Davon Love, who's the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and Amanda Yee, the editor of Liberation News and also the host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. A lot to get into here. Obviously, you know, the criminal legal system is a major issue in general and an even bigger one, as we heard with Kamala Harris's background. And, you know, Davon, I don't know if there's anything that struck you in the interview, but right now, I think, or over the Biden administration, you know, they spent about $12.8 billion to fund 100,000 new cops on the street, while only spending about $2.4 billion on, you know, non-police ways of addressing community violence. And not all of that was even spent. So we're seeing something about the priorities of the Biden-Harris administration. Don't know if it'll carry over to the Harris-Walz administration. But I wonder what you think about some of these topics as it concerns the criminal legal system in this election.
So a bunch of things, I think. The first I'll say is that what was described by the previous guest about Kamala Harris' record on many of these issues, I would describe as the mainstream of the Democratic Party. So I would say over the past few years, the Democratic Party has tried to sound progressive on many of these issues. You have a few individual prosecutors, a few individual elected officials who are progressive within the Democratic Party on this issue. But the Democratic mainstream, right, is where your previous guest described, which is a commitment to the kind of status quo system of mass incarceration. And one of the things that the Democratic Party has done, and this is something I think is really important for many of your listeners to understand the way the Democratic Party messages on this, that what has happened is that in progressive circles, there's this discourse that what drove mass incarceration was overly harsh penalties on nonviolent drug offenders. And it's important to demystify that because that wasn't the driver of mass incarceration. Much of mass incarceration happened at a local level. Much of it happened as a result of crime that was deemed proximate to violent crime. In fact, in many cases, in many states, you'll see that one of the most popular charges are like second-degree assault, right? So things that result, or possession of a firearm, right? Or possession of firearm, commission of a violent crime. And all of that is important because what happens is that the racialized notions of Black people being inherently criminal, inherently violent, and so then you think about like the drug dealer trope, right? That unless you're dealing with the fact that many of the folks that are engaged in the drug trade, which is often, whether it's explicitly or implicitly, it is attributed to the violence that exists in the community, even when it is not the driver of violence, right? Drug trafficking is the proxy that is used to then talk about why law enforcement and prosecutors are so important. And so the point is that we have to deal with the fact that the white supremacist notion of Black people being inherently criminal, therefore demonizing people who enter a industry, right, in the illicit drug trade, who don't have access to other traditional forms of economic mobility. So they're subject to a market where it is unregulated. It is a cash market, so they need firearms in order to protect themselves, right? So these aren't people that, you know, when you think about the propaganda, the societal propaganda, these aren't people that are just hankering to engage in violence. These are folks that, because of the societal conditions that limited their economic mobility, have created an environment where violence is a necessary part of navigating the space. But what has happened is that Black folks have been, you know, for many decades, kind of represented as inherently violent and criminal. And that is the primary driver of mass incarceration. And so I say that to say that the Democratic Party, even Black Democrats, right, themselves have succumbed to that notion, right, and are afraid to deal with the fact that, you know, what has happened is that working class and poor Black folks in, you know, places around the United States, right, that have some of those socioeconomic challenges, that unless we deal with the fact that it is that societal propaganda, right, that often contributes to the way that law enforcement deals with our community, then we're going to continue to be in this situation. In addition, one of the things we need to focus on is investment in community-based violence prevention, where the community is the tool for addressing the violence in our community. And what is unfortunate is that the Democratic Party will not elevate that. Now, there is some movement on the federal level to provide more funding to community-based violence prevention, right? And I think that's a result of pressure, like folks who have pushed against mass incarceration. I think in some ways the Democratic Party has moved funding federally almost as a concession to that, but you won't hear that in their dialogue and discourse. You hear in their discourse, Vice President Kamala Harris talk about herself as a prosecutor. So you don't hear them distancing themselves from the carceral apparatus that is driving mass incarceration. And so I think that's important for the listeners to know. And then the last thing that I would say to the question is around the perceptions of crime. And your previous guest, I think, is spot on in terms of the way that the media representations, particularly when you think about Sinclair Broadcasting, right, who own stations across the United States, have been driving narratives of rising crime waves. And that even here, like I mentioned, here in Baltimore, you have Fox 45 that runs stories all the time about the crime and violence that happens in Baltimore, even though we've had a historic decline in homicides. We were over 300 homicides for about 10 years. Last year was the first year in 10 years that it was under 300. And we're about to be probably under 200 homicides in 2024. But even though the homicides have gone down precipitously as a result of community-based violence prevention, so it wasn't law enforcement-centric approaches to engaging violence, because the police department in Baltimore claims to be short about a few hundred officers. But even in spite of that, it has been the community-based violence prevention that has driven down homicides. But that's not the narrative that you get across the media. What you get is the politically expedient notions of inherent criminality amongst Black folks to justify the reification of the existing carceral system. And again, the Democrats are not, and one of the things that I think is in the Democrats' own political interest, but they're too cowardly to address it, is to push back against the media, the Sinclair Broadcasting and other proximate media that are pushing these narratives, attempting to reify the carceral system as the instinct that people go to as it relates to how to deal with public safety.
I saw this interesting, that not at all surprising, but it might be to most people, statistic that we often see. I think it's like repeated every year. Numbers show this, is that law enforcement each year for a very long time has seized more from people than burglars have stolen that year. And that's the case for 2023 as well as 2022. It's like you can find an article for each year about that. Because police will do like an asset forfeiture. They'll literally just take people's stuff, which is just incredible when you think about, the police are supposed to protect you from burglaries, but it turns out like they're actually responsible for taking the most of our stuff. But all that said, when it comes to Kamala Harris specifically, I recall, and I'm sure all of you remember that video of her from back not that long ago, but I remember it was like playing on repeat when she was picked as the vice presidential candidate. It was her making fun of activists who wanted to build more schools, less jails, and she's like walking around being like, all these activists, they want to build more schools, less jails. There's a fundamental problem with that, is what Kamala Harris said as the top cop or top prosecutor or whatever, which she's known for. But I think it's really interesting because it speaks to Democrats in general, as you were talking, Davon, which is the fact that on the one hand, they basically end up taking the energy of these movements against police violence, co-opting it sometimes into the Democratic Party, whether it's after Ferguson, after Baltimore, after George Floyd, and all of these instances that cause these mass uprisings, taking that and then expanding policings like Republicans might. And they do the same thing with the border. I mean, one of the only campaign ads that I've seen from Kamala Harris showing any sense of what policy she wants to institute is her promising to hire tens of thousands of more border guards. I guess trying to run to the right of Trump on that. I'm not sure where she was going with that. But I'm curious, Amanda, your thoughts on all of this. The fact that at the end of the day, the Democrats are such a pro-policing, pro-mass incarceration party, while sometimes, depending on who they're talking to, pretending not to be.
Yeah, I really appreciated Alec's connection of Kamala Harris's mass incarceration policies to her immigration policies, and the connection between those two, because I think they're they're interrelated, they're connected, right? And I really appreciated the way that he called Kamala an empty vessel. You know, he said that what she does, what's most politically expedient for herself. And she's someone who's willing to do whatever. You know, she used cash bail to pressure people into pleading guilty one day. Then all of a sudden she's an opponent of cash bail when it's politically suitable for her. And, you know, she was a prosecutor who threw poor and working class people in prison, but now she's running on a pro-worker, pro-middle class agenda, as we saw from the DNC, right? Because I think the Democrats have kind of sensed where the winds have shifted, and they realize that a lot of people are really struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling to make rent. Groceries are really expensive. Inflation is through the roof. And so they see that, and they're trying to cast her as this pro-working class candidate. But on the issue of immigration policy, Rania, like you said, now Kamala is trying to outflank Trump from the right on immigration because the country has moved so far to the right. Harris has basically maintained Biden's border policy on the campaign trail, which was a continuation of the far-right policy that Trump originally put into place. And what's really interesting is that she is now the leading face of the Democratic Party, the same party which in 2020 campaigned on a no more kids in cages at the border as a way to position herself morally against Trump, you know. And the administration she presides over has only continued this policy. And now they call cages something like migrant facilities for children. And at a recent campaign stop in Atlanta, Harris has even tried to outflank Trump from the right on immigration, claiming, you know, she said something like Donald Trump has been talking a big game about the border, but he does not walk the walk. And she just released a new campaign ad in which she brags about how much tougher she is on the border than Trump. And she even says that she supports increasing the number of Border Patrol agents. So I think this really speaks to what Alec was saying in that Kamala Harris does what's politically expedient for herself. She's a vessel. She doesn't really have any sort of principles, of course. But the upside of that is that we can build power as a movement because people like Kamala Harris obviously don't care about immigrants, but they are going to respond to pressure from the movement. So I guess that's the upside to that.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that counts as an upside, and I think it's an important piece of all of it. And, you know, a lot of things that can be said here on a number of different fronts. One thing I'll just quickly note here before we want to go to another element, you know, one thing that really stood out to me, or that we haven't heard anything about at all from Kamala Harris, that Biden tried to make a big deal in 2020, was that they were going to have a lot more grants of clemency. And ultimately that did not really play out the way they were going to. But I think when we look at markers of where she stands, you know, there's a backlog of 18,000 clemency petitions right now, people, many of whom absolutely deserve to be set free after long terms in prison. So I think when people who are out here who are looking to your point, Amanda, you know, where can you focus? Where can you try to hold them accountable? How can you have a benchmark by which you're saying, this is what we would like to see? I mean, there are many, many, many things that are out there. When we talk about mass incarceration, there are literally tens of thousands of people who are waiting to have their cases reviewed. This was something the Biden-Harris administration was supposed to aggressively push forward, which they did not do. And I think that would be another sort of interesting point to raise as it concerns people looking for places to hold their feet to the fire and try to make some significant change, as it were. And just a final note here, 1.9 million people in the United States being held in cages at the federal, state, local, tribal, and immigration level. So a huge, huge population of people. But we want to move
real quick,
to.
Real quick,
Go ahead,
before
please.
Before you move on to that, I also wanted to note, which got a teeny bit of attention, but not enough, that everybody was very excited about. Oh my gosh, her vice presidential pick of Walz is so progressive, you know, and he's got that Midwestern swagger. But he was praised by Donald Trump for how he handled the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that also falls into the category of what we're discussing when it comes to the Democrats and how this particular administration reacts to mass incarceration and police violence. But please go
Can
ahead.
I say something real quick? 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, please.
Real quick. So one of the tricks that the Democrats play is that at the top level, they will commit to doing things that actually at the national level, they don't have the power to do. One of those is that when you think about the majority of those that are incarcerated in the United States are state and local prisons, which means that the president of the United States only has the power to deal with those who are doing Fed time, right? So if Democrats were serious, not only would they themselves say that they would grant clemency, but they would then pressure governors, especially the governors, the Democratic governors, to get them to, because that is actually will be the more impactful thing. But again, part of the trick of the Democrats is that they will claim to do things that actually they don't really have the power to do or require state action. And instead of using their power or influence at the top of the ticket, they don't actually follow through. So I think that's something that's important for people to also pay attention to.
No, I think that is actually critically important for people to know, and maybe one of those sand they throw in our eyes to make it a lot harder to tell what's going on. So no, really, really important point there. I mean, all important points here. And I think this is one of the points, by the way, because you're watching here live on Breakthrough News and Free Speech TV, that should be a good reminder to you of why independent alternative media is absolutely critical. Where else are you going to hear Amanda Yee and Davon Love able to talk at length and not just, random bullet points about the context and the depth and the substance of the issues that face us, not just, the atmospherics and effluvia that I assume is what is on CNN and MSNBC and Fox right now. I can't say because we're here, but nonetheless, just a reminder again, Breakthrough News, Free Speech TV, special coverage of the Democratic National Convention here. We have been talking a lot tonight, of course, about the issue of Gaza, about everything that's going on with the uncommitted movement, the uncommitted delegates, and we are very happy that our team on the ground in Chicago was able to interview one of the uncommitted delegates there at the DNC. Huwaida Araf is this uncommitted delegate here. Kei Pritsker was able to interview her, I believe it was yesterday. So let's hear from Huwaida from the perspective of an uncommitted delegate.
Okay, so we're here outside the DNC with
Huwaida Araf.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So you're here. I see you're Democrat for Palestinian Rights, keffiyeh, scarf, tassel. So what's it like in there? How you experiencing the DNC as someone who's openly supporting Palestinian rights?
To be honest, it's not easy. I'm here because I believe that we need to fight wherever we can. I mean, on the outside, on the inside, in the courtroom, in the streets, and this is part of trying to fight within the Democratic Party to change policy. Right now, the administration changing its policy, and hopefully, if the next administration is a Democratic one, that they will know Democrats are against genocide, Democrats are against apartheid. And so we're here talking to other delegates. I am a uncommitted delegate from Michigan. And so we're here talking to other delegates about the importance of signing on to our statement and our request to the Democratic Party that they support an arms embargo on Israel. And the reception when you're talking to people one-on-one is great. And that's what polls show, that an overwhelming majority of people support an immediate ceasefire and support suspending arms to Israel. But when you're sitting in these caucuses, when you're sitting in these meetings, and you hear the Democrats talking up themselves, how they are the party that protects rights and how they are the party that, is the future and defends the marginalized and doesn't leave anyone behind, and says nothing, about a genocide taking place that is being enabled by a Democratic administration, it not only feels like you not only feel sick, but me as a Palestinian, I'm thinking like, you talking about being a big tent and all of these people you're bringing in, but you're basically telling me like my family living under apartheid or getting bombed to death and Palestinian children being decapitated and or starved or blown to pieces doesn't even matter. Like, it's not worth a mention. So I went today to sit in on like the Youth Council, the Women's Caucus, the Interfaith Caucus, thinking that they would mention something, or else maybe there is an opening to ask a question, but nothing. No questions, not a mention. So it makes you feel like what is your place here? Does the Democratic Party have room for Palestinians? Do they recognize Palestinians as deserving equal rights? And they say, like, I'm asked, oh, what do you think? Is Kamala going to be better than Biden? I'm like, well, that's a really low bar. So I think it's important to be here to send that message. And again, one-on-one, people get it and don't support our government enabling a genocide. But the party as a whole, are they hearing us? I don't think so.
So you're saying that you're actually hearing people in private sort of express sympathy, but then obviously in public, when people get on stage, they don't even mention the issue. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, when you're talking to other delegates one-on-one, yes, they agree what's happening is terrible and they don't want to be part of that. But they're also, I feel like a large majority of them are so wrapped up in electing Democrats that they're fine ignoring it for now. They're fine not disrupting the whole agenda and looking at others who are trying to disrupt. I mean, you have to disrupt. You have to to stop a genocide, you have to disrupt. But ceasefire delegates or uncommitted delegates are actually, not trying to disrupt the meetings or anything like that, but trying to kind of push from the inside. And I think on an individual level, again, Democrats, Americans don't want to be supporting a genocide. The party as a whole, I think, has other considerations and are fine throwing us crumbs like, oh, we feel bad, oh, we sympathize with you, but we're not willing to change policy. I mean, that's the message we're getting. We're still hoping that there is room and we're going to continue to push. There was a push in the lead up to this this convention. There's going to be a push also leading up to the elections. And our message is like, look, if you can't tell us, if you can't guarantee that you're going to change policy, you're not going to get our vote. You're not going to get our vote, and you're not going to get the vote of the hundreds of thousands of people who came out in the primaries and voted uncommitted, and a larger number of progressives, of Arab Muslim Americans, of young people who are so disgusted with our current policy. You're not going to get them to vote either. And if you're fine without our votes, if you think that you're going to win, then go ahead and try. But I wouldn't be so optimistic. I wouldn't be so confident. I guess let me add too, there's the problem of that dual purpose, if you will, or dual argument that you're putting across. It feels almost soul-sucking to have to say, look, if you want to win, let's not support a genocide. Like, I should be able to say, let's not support a genocide because it's morally wrong, it's repugnant to support a genocide, but you find yourself having to put forward that argument. Look, we don't think you'll be able to win if you don't change policy and stop supporting this genocide. So putting it forward from this is what's better for your chances to win in the Democratic Party is, all right, that's an argument, but that shouldn't be the primary argument. The primary argument should be what is moral, what is ethical, what is right, and that is not sending bombs to blow children to pieces.
So you're saying that the party leadership is really not even listening to the delegates, really?
They are giving I think they're trying to placate, but not to keep things kind of quiet, not to disrupt, to show that we're united and then united going forward to beat Trump. Great, let's beat Trump, but we're not united if you're telling us that our big issue and one this big and one that can that affects our families and our friends don't count. So I think they're trying to placate. We're trying to push back and say these crumbs aren't enough. It is not enough, not only not to get our vote, but not to get the votes of our families, friends, communities, and the hundreds of thousands of uncommitted voters. And all the weeks leading up to this convention, there has been kind of talks, kind of communication going on. There should have been more here. The Democratic platform should have included something on this, and it doesn't, and they're not going to give a chance to add amendments. They're just going to try to get a vote on it and push it through. And again, it's just to show that we are united, but we're not. What they're doing is marginalizing or trying to silence us. As you may have seen yesterday during Biden's speech, there was a couple of delegates who unfurled a Stop Arming Israel banner, and not only did some people jump on them, but then there were instructions to other delegates, raise your signs, cover their banners, chant louder than them. What does it say about your party when you are trying to mask or pretend that a genocide's not taking place? That's what you do in action. But then the next morning at our breakfast meetings, you're telling us how great the Democratic Party is and how there's room for everyone. And this is the future. And this is the way that we can protect our lives and our democracy and the most marginal. It is, it's like, I don't know if you call it cognitive dissonance or something. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for us.
So you're not supporting Kamala at this convention?
Currently, no. She does not have my vote, no.
And, coming from Michigan, being an uncommitted delegate, do you think many of the voters you've met or talked to where you're from would support Kamala Harris if she doesn't implement a ceasefire or an arms embargo on Israel?
So there is a lot of discussion going on, and people definitely recognize the danger of Trump. So that's not what we want, but it's also this feeling, this moral position that I also can't vote for an administration that is going to continue this policy, and a policy that has enabled and actively participated in a genocide. So we're really in a very difficult position. And we are hoping, at least the Uncommitted campaign was hoping, let's try to move this party so that we can work together and prevent a Trump presidency, because we don't think he's going to be any better for Palestine, certainly not for the country at all. But the party isn't giving us much to go on because there is too much hurt, there's been too much slaughter, there's too much pain and distress, and you're not going to get people to go out and vote for the Harris ticket because she shows more empathy. I mean, I'm glad she sympathizes with Palestinian mothers and children that are being slaughtered. But again, that is not going to stop the slaughter. A commitment to changing policy is, and we don't have that. And it's not even a big ask. It's not even a big ask. It is just abiding by U.S. law and international law. Just say you'll respect U.S. law and international law, and that will equal an arms embargo. That should be a no-brainer. That should be a given, but it's not.
Well, I think they're here to get you now and throw you away in the slammer for that one. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And appreciate you pushing this issue inside the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Trying, but when we need to keep pushing from outside, right? So the demonstrations that are happening, that's great. Everywhere that we can push, we have to. Yeah.
Well, Rania, obviously a critically important issue there, and that was Huwaida Araf, an uncommitted delegate from the state of Michigan. I mean, I'll just maybe ask you some of your thoughts, Rania, and perhaps we can all pull up alongside that some of the recent polling we have from Michigan that I think helps really bring home, exactly how close this is about 2 percentage points there between Trump and Biden. Obviously, there's RFK Jr., Jill Stein, and Cornel West. RFK also basically 100% for Israel, but certainly, both Jill Stein and Cornel West who are listed there, and I think only Jill Stein's on the ballot in Michigan. Obviously, this could play a big role when you've got 2% between the two major candidates. If the genocide is ongoing, over 40,000 people already been killed. Rania, it certainly seems possible that this could really hobble Vice President Harris there in a critical state. Oh, Rania, you might be muted.
My apologies. I got to do it at least once every live stream. But absolutely, Eugene. I mean, this is a demonstration that for the Democratic Party, supporting U.S. imperialism is far more important than winning a swing state. And I think that demonstrates a lot about where the Democratic Party stands when it comes to the issue of genocide and when it comes to the issue of foreign policy. They are in the pockets of the military-industrial complex. They are very close to the Israel lobby. They are very close to the idea of this supremacist apartheid settler state existing to enforce U.S. policy in the Middle East so they can get oil for cheap, no matter how many lives it costs, because it's worth it, as Madeleine Albright, the first female Secretary of State, said about the children that died in Iraq from U.S. sanctions back in the 90s. So not at all surprised, but what really spoke to me about Huwaida's interview, she said so many important things, but the fact that she said it's crazy that we have to sit here and make this argument like, stop supporting genocide so you can win this election, as opposed to, you shouldn't be supporting genocide. Like, you have to say, please stop killing my people. And then that way you can win. I mean, what kind of sick party leadership is this? Is what comes to mind. Like, just psychotic, sociopathic, pro-murder, pro-genocide, pro-slaughtering babies and Israeli rape dungeons party is this?
Yeah, I mean, it raises a lot of questions, I think, on a number of different fronts. And, of course, there's still the ongoing issue of the ceasefire. I see Al Jazeera has been reporting recently that I think in the past couple hours, Biden and Harris actually held a phone call with Netanyahu today to, quote unquote, impress the urgency on him of the need to get a ceasefire. But, one of the things is, they're just talking. I mean, they're obviously not taking any real legitimate steps. I mean, they're giving billions of dollars to them in weapons. So why would they stop? Why would they do anything? I mean, they're not even doing the most basic low-hanging fruit type things that they could do on a range of different issues. I mean, zero movement on the issue of settlements in the West Bank, and that's sort of outside of Gaza. But the reason I highlight it is because the U.S. government has, in fact, stated many times it considers most of those settlements to be illegal. So even in the context where Israel is aggressively pushing forward actions the U.S. government itself agrees to be illegal, they are not, they're not sanctioning anybody. They're not really doing anything whatsoever. I mean, I know they put a few visa bans on a handful, like 7 or 8 settlers, but they're not taking any real significant action. And, more to the point, Rania, or maybe not more to the point, but just further to the point, when you look at what was in the Democratic platform vis-a-vis Israel, I mean, a total slap in the face to anyone who cares about Palestine. I mean, it was, I read it. I had to read it 3 or 4 times because I was honestly confused because it has a number of positions that are actually not the U.S. government positions. So, you actually have the president of the United States party taking positions. But the thing looked like it was written by the Likud party on many levels. I mean, one of the things that really stood out to me is it said Jerusalem should be the capital of Israel. Well, Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel. Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel. It's the right-wing, Likudnik type people and other right-wing parties that have been trying to get, and the U.S. did this, of course, people to move their embassy to Jerusalem so that they can claim that it's there. And the language that was used in the Democratic platform is the language that's used by these far-right parties in Israel, that Jerusalem should be the undivided capital of Israel. Now, that's notable. And I say, why is that notable, Rania? Well, also tonight, I believe Bill Clinton is slated to speak. Perhaps he's already spoken and we might have missed it, but I don't believe he has. I think it will be coming up in prime time. But President Clinton, of course, negotiated the Oslo Accords, and many things we could say about that. But one of the key pillars of the Oslo Accords was that East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. So, I mean, ultimately, they're even going back on what many people consider to be sort of a historic, capitulation in many ways to Israeli demands on Palestinians in the Oslo Accords. They're even going further back than that. So, I mean, what a slap in the face. I mean, not only is there no serious movement on a ceasefire, as you pointed out very, very well, not only are people having to beg and plead to end a genocide in the most ridiculous way, but even the platform itself is taking on these extreme far-right characteristics. I mean, it really is just you feel through the looking glass on so many different levels. And we'll see how this continues to come up. But I think as Hawaida Araf, who we heard from there, the uncommitted delegate, pointed out, both she herself and many others, will not be voting for Kamala Harris at this point because of this. So again, a close race and, a lot to see here. But I don't want to say too much more on this. We can come back to more on it later. But we want to bring in our next guest, who we are very, very honored to be joined by here, who is Tara Houska, who's an Indigenous lawyer, water protector, and organizer. Tara, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, it's great to have you. I wanted to just get your first thoughts here. I mean, when the DNC opened, they did open with some words from some representatives of a native nation, I think in the essence of trying to show that they really are in tune with the idea of indigenous rights. And I just sort of wonder what you think about that sort of, that being their messaging, but also, where we really stand in terms of what Harris has done and the Biden administration has done over these 4 years. And maybe, in the future, do you really think they are embracing indigenous sovereignty and rights in a serious way?
I think land acknowledgements are the embodiment of neoliberalism and the belief of putting together a series of pretty words and doing very, very little to actually implement those words, right? Which is what we're seeing on pretty much every facet of the agenda, whether that's climate or whether that's human rights or whether that's actively stopping a genocide, right? It's words, but not actions. I'm Anishinaabe. Chicago is my people's traditional homelands. And to see that gross caricature of respect for Indigenous people while actively exterminating Indigenous people is, yeah, I mean, that speaks for itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the land acknowledgement to open is so stunning, especially considering what's happening in Palestine, not to mention what happens across the U.S. And I'm curious if you could perhaps, update us on where the Democratic Party stands on the issue of Indigenous rights in the U.S. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Standing Rock was in the news. It was a dominant headline and certainly has fallen out from liberal circles. I mean, we certainly don't hear the Democrats talk about that or access to resources or the pollution of resources across the country, particularly in areas where they still don't abide by various agreements they have with Indigenous tribes.
Standing Rock, that entire resistance and all of the police brutality and tanks out on the prairies of North Dakota on the traditional treaty lands of the Lakota people, all of that happened under the Obama administration. I then left standing with those relatives over there because the pipeline was built to come to my own homelands over in Minnesota, where Tim Walz was the governor. And then fought another pipeline and was brutalized again by law enforcement. And the creation of a federal, state, and private security task force called the Northern Lights Task Force. Minnesota actually learned from Standing Rock and chose to engage in actively facilitating over $8 million worth of money that Enbridge, the company, poured into local police and into our Department of Natural Resources. I mean, directly engaged in destruction of land, territory, and our rights to hunt, gather, and be well. These are treaty rights that were guaranteed for the creation of this country. But how quickly they forget, right? Now they're touting Tim Walz as a climate champion because of a few small band-aids that were put on to pacify after approving the largest tar sands infrastructure project in North America. That is the Democrats' policy that I've seen. More oil and gas leases approved during the first 2 years of the Biden administration with Deb Haaland leading the Department of the Interior than the Trump administration, right? Like, these are the folks that call themselves climate champions. These are the folks that are saying, we are going to do different and we are a different party. No, you're going to put band-aids on as you actively destroy and continue to pillage and irrevocably harm nature. And at this point now, I mean, we're going after, it looks like we're looking at active attacks on humanity, right? Like, genocide is not just an attack on Palestinian people, it is an attack on all of humanity. We are watching children being killed every single day. I mean, right before this, I'm looking at the inside of a child's head and then switching to Democrats gripping and grinning to a stadium of people all cheering and talking about how great they are, right? It's like, how can you live with yourself? How can we live as people and to continue to function knowing that something so egregious and evil is happening? It is not just an assault on them, it's an assault on us all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and Tara, I'm glad you brought up the Northern Lights Task Force. Another thing that I think our listeners might be interested to know here, the spokesperson for that task force, John Elder, was also the spokesperson for the Minneapolis police after the George Floyd killing, who put out the initial press release saying that George Floyd had resisted police officers and only, quote unquote, appeared to be suffering medical distress. Thankfully, the video of that brave bystander came out to show it. But another interesting connection. But I also say that just to maybe maybe, and of course, anything you want to comment on that, I'm happy to hear as well, Tara. But I also wanted to ask you to go and maybe just say a little bit more about the police brutality against the water protectors and others at Line 3, when Tim Walz is governor of Minnesota, because I think that's a heavily overlooked issue.
I think when you bring up those direct connections between, I mean, that's what we're saying when we talk about intersectionality, right? Like, it is not just Palestinian liberation. It is not just Black Lives Matter. It is not just, water is life. These are all so deeply intertwined and interconnected. There is a reason why cop cities are being built all over the United States, right? Like, there is a reason why we see this growing unrest and this very multifaceted effort to suppress that unrest. In Minnesota, it was the same types of tactics, heavy surveillance. At one point in my private home, I had on a dirt road, I was living about 300 yards off the pipeline route for a number of years. I had police officers show up by the dozens to tell me that my driveway was no longer a driveway, and they blockaded it and arrested over a dozen people. 50 police officers lined up in a riot line in a dirt road to try to suppress and harass and scare us. That's ultimately what they were trying to do. Sending over, DHS helicopters almost every other day. Then denying those helicopters. That actually took an NPR journalist who was dusted by one of those helicopters to say, no, I took a picture of it. It happened to me. They're not lying, right? The same types of things you see with any of the Ferguson protests, with any of the folks who have done in any way, shape, or form standing up against the state, right? Like, that is... The brutality continues, and the suppression and active attempts to silence continue, which is assaults on free speech, assaults on individuals, going after them through RICO. I'm currently being sued for $4 million alongside a bunch of other folks over for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which was another Democrat handoff, right? Like, they overturned over a decade worth of grassroots pressure and local pressure to stop the Mountain Valley Pipeline, to then get their Inflation Reduction Act, right? And they gutted parts of the Clean Water Act and NEPA and all kinds of bedrock environmental law to do it.
Wow. I also, by the way, was not aware of Tim Walz's role in what you described when it comes to Indigenous issues. But I'm curious if you could also speak, I know you've already touched on this a lot, but when it comes to, Kamala Harris is the vice president in the Biden administration. She doesn't have much policy on her website, so I'm just going to go ahead and assume her ideas for an administration, unless she has said otherwise, will be a continuation of what we see now. What has been Biden's record on climate justice?
Yeah, I touched a little bit on the fact that what I see is a pattern of behavior that is throughout the so-called left, right, which is the Democrats, right? Like, I don't really know that they're necessarily left. I think that the U.S. version of left is actually more central, right? Like, it keeps getting shoved further and further right. It's a pattern of drill, baby, drill, but we'll also engage in some solar panels and electric cars, right? Like, we will continue to wage a full-on war on the finite natural resources and homelands and habitable space that we as human beings need to live, while trying to electrify the grid. That is not climate solution making. It is not in line with science. It's not in line with any desire to provide our children a habitable home. We are actually actively stealing from the next generation. That's when we talk about the seventh generation, which I'm sure that many land acknowledgements do. Those are not just pretty words. That's a real concept of, we are stewards, right? We are holding on to what belongs to someone else. And it's not just human beings, it's all of us, right? Like, I don't know. I see their policies, and it is pretty heartbreaking, to say the least, that these are the folks who call themselves climate champions, and that's what passes for a climate champion. in the current state of affairs.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is. It really is something. I'll just say it like that, to see that this is, what's presented as so-called transformative change. Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us. I know you have a lot going on. Tara Houska, water protector and organizer, thanks so much for joining us here on this special DNC show on Free Speech TV and Breakthrough News.
Thank you so much, you guys. Thanks for your work.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are...
Wow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're continuing to be live here. As you can see, we are joined once again by Davon Love, who's the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and Amanda Yee, host of the China Report on Breakthrough News and also the editor of Liberation News. Important points here, from Tara about a lot of different points there. And of course, to the extent you all want to speak on that, I'm happy to hear it. But I do want to just, as we come to the last 15 minutes or so of our broadcast here in the lead up to the primetime piece, Tim Walz, Coach Walz, as many are calling him, will be speaking this evening, his debut to the world. Glad you like that, Amanda. And I will, I want to ask you this, Amanda, in a way, because the Tim Walz sort of phenomenon, which, all of a sudden, I guess he's America's granddad, this is what everyone's saying, is taking an interesting turn vis-a-vis something we talked about earlier, the new Cold War on China. Republicans are aggressively attacking Tim Walz. He's actually being investigated now by a House committee. He was a teacher in China, I believe, in 1989. He took a number of people-to-people trips there, I think, with high school students. And then in Congress, I know that China was an issue he focused on quite a bit. Maybe I'll just ask it to you, Amanda, and the way the Republicans are framing it, that Tim Walz is a very good friend of the People's Republic of China, and that if he becomes vice president, he will abandon the policies that we've seen under Biden and Trump, and even to some degree Obama, to demonize China. How do you evaluate that claim by Trump and other Republicans?
I think it's pretty baseless, but I think this investigation into Walz just really shows you just how much of a fever pitch the new Cold War has reached at this point, right? As you said, on Friday, House Republicans launched an investigation into Tim Walz over his connections to China. And if you read the FBI, the letter that James Comer wrote to the FBI, the accusations are pretty baseless, and it's just a lot of fear mongering, right? It's a lot of, he taught at this one school, and this one school supposedly has connections to China. The letter that he wrote urging the probe brings up as supposed evidence the fact that, as you mentioned, Eugene, Walz taught English in China in 1989 as part of a Teach Abroad program run by Harvard. The letter brings up as supposed evidence the program that he ran with his wife, which coordinated trips to China. The letter accused Walz of serving as a fellow at a Chinese institute, which they accuse of maintaining devotion to the Chinese Communist Party. What's really interesting is that Comer in this letter said that Walz himself has admitted that he does not fall into the category that China necessarily needs to be, that the relationship that we have with China, it doesn't necessarily need to be an adversarial one. So I think that's really indicative of how far we've gone off the deep end with this new Cold War, right? That even simply stating that we shouldn't go to war with China, that we should cooperate with China in some aspects, that we should have peaceful relations with China, that automatically puts a target on your back in these kinds of McCarthyite witch hunts. And I mean, to answer your question, this isn't really to say that Walz is friendly to China in any way based on his previous record, right? Walz spent over a decade on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which is this body that's focused on scrutinizing the Chinese government's human rights abuses, right? And Walz also backed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which imposed sanctions on Chinese and Hong Kong officials during the 2020 anti-government protests. So I really don't see Walz as friendly to China as these Republicans like to claim. And I just think that, if Kamala Harris were elected, he would continue the escalation on China. But I think this investigation into his connections to China, it just really goes to show how the war drive against China is a bipartisan affair in which both sides are trying to outdo the other.
Gosh, Democrats, when I looked at their platform, I was so stunned by how almost neoconservative it's not almost, it was like a neoconservative platform when it came to particularly the US and the Middle East, but in general, whether it's Russia, when Biden spoke, he had everybody cheering for NATO. The entire convention was like standing ovation for NATO. It was just completely insane. It just seems like from every issue, whether we're talking about domestic to foreign policy, this is a right-wing party. And I don't know how I guess because it's not quite as right-wing as the Republicans, it somehow manages to sell itself as progressives, and then people feel like they have no choice but to fall behind the Democrats. But from everything we've discussed on this live stream, is there any policy, Davon, I'll give it to you. Is there any policy area you can think of where Democrats are actually pushing a progressive agenda? It's a tough question.
Well, I would say, the Democrats as an institution do not have a commitment to progressive policies to the extent that there are individual actions or electeds who push a more progressive agenda. Is because, as was mentioned previously, the base of the Democratic Party is at a different place politically than those who run and lead the party. So they're having to do the work of doing some capitulation, right, to the base of their party in order to maintain their legitimacy, to do something that, Gramsci once described the notion of incorporated resistance, right? So that there's clear understanding of the importance of, placating a base while making sure that it maintains the policy interest of those that finance the interest at the top of the party. One thing I want to say a little bit about the China piece, though, that I think is important, because I think that both parties' stance on China is through a lens of the kind of white supremacist xenophobia. But I want to drill down on something that I think is actually an interesting overlap, right? Where Tim Walz represents in the American political landscape the kind of white working class Midwesterner. And when you look at Donald Trump's election in 2016, there are many people that attribute his victory to, and I think accurately so, to the hollowing out of the manufacturing base in the Midwest. Now, a good policy and that is a legitimate concern. Now, a good policy to address that, right, would be to invest in, local, cooperatively owned, community-owned enterprises, right, against the kind of transnational corporations that really buttress the elite element of the Democratic Party. Many of these transnational corporations, right, that in many respects have contributed to the outsourcing of so much of labor, and contribute to the kind of, conditions in places all over the world, substandard working conditions all over the world created that dynamic. And so if there was, what is interesting, though, is that instead of understanding their own white working class base and thinking about how do you invest in more manufacturing, how do you invest in the ability for local economies to thrive, again, against transnational corporations, what actually ends up happening is you get the policies where there is an antagonistic relationship, particularly from the right wing and center part of both the Republican and Democratic Party, where you get an antagonistic stance, right, to China, using some of the Cold War tropes that really are that are not in touch with the fact that the actual real material challenge is the impact of outsourcing, and that part of the kind of white supremacist xenophobia that the discourse is tainted in, and the conversation around China, it refuses to acknowledge that the actual problem is white working class folks who've lost jobs as a result of the neoliberal economic model, right, that the Democratic Party endorses. And so, if the Democratic Party were serious, right, that would be the conversation in terms of a policy that addresses the concerns while not engaging in the xenophobia and kind of Cold War discourse that props up notions of U.S. imperialism and American exceptionalism.
One of the things that I think is notable about this, and I kind of touched on it earlier, but I'd be curious your thoughts on this, Amanda. We haven't talked a lot about it, but here we are, independent alternative media, so I think we should, is so much obviously of how people view this election is through the New York Times, through the CNNs, through the NPRs, through all these mainstream media sort of outlets. And I mean, I just wonder what you think about the role of the media in the context and setting the framework for a lot of these discussions, because obviously the politicians can say whatever they want to say, but all these talking head shows could easily reframe it, change it, contextualize it, debunk it, or whatever. But they seem to just kind of run with, so many of these narratives, oftentimes even when they're completely fact-free.
Yeah, so I think one of the amazing things that the Palestine movement has really done is to kind of shine a light on how mainstream media like the New York Times and the Washington Post, how they completely just lie on the issue of Palestine. As part of these protests that we've, I've been a part of over the past 10 months or so, a lot of times the protests will go to the New York Times and just call them out on their framing of issues like Gaza. Last week, we also participated in a protest outside of Fox News offices, calling them out on their imperialist lies against Venezuela. So I think, to speak to your point, I think one of the amazing things about the Palestine movement is that it's showing people the role that mainstream media, mainstream corporate media plays in upholding these imperialist narratives. And I think once people see that, this issue of Palestine, if they're lying on this issue, then they can start to question what other issues that mainstream media is lying about as well. And so we can sort of direct them to, lies that they're telling about Venezuela, for example, Venezuela's elections, and how they've really demonized Maduro, and how, they have a certain interest in overthrowing Maduro. We can talk about how the media lies on China, and we can have a conversation about, what exactly are the U.S. interests in China. Why does China want to undermine Xi Jinping? Why does the U.S. want to undermine Xi Jinping? Why does the U.S. Want to undermine China? What are its specific interests there? So I think that's what's really been promising, is that a lot of people are starting to really question the role of corporate media in the first place and how it upholds these U.S. imperialist interests.
Yeah. No, sorry, Rania, did I cut you off?
No, I was just agreeing with Amanda, and sitting in sitting in an important other end of imperialism kind of place, the other side of imperialism, as Vijay Prashad calls it. I can tell you right now, I mean, there's billions of people around the world who have to endure so much violence, economic violence, actual physical violence from bombing campaigns, policies of, not just economic destitution, but also starvation, sanctions, just that completely deprive them of their material needs and just their dignity and their sovereignty in such vile ways. And the Democratic Party is a huge contributor to that. It's the primary contributor to that. And I think that speaks to the fact that, when we're stuck with these two options, these different flavors of genocidal psychopaths, you end up with a situation like this where there's these, uncommitted delegates inside the convention that are protesting it. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the stream, Amanda, it's like Gaza is the elephant in the room, and Gaza is the worst outcome, the worst, visual representation of what U.S. imperialism represents. And that is just live streamed mass slaughter. And they are ignoring it in decadence. They are ignoring it in decadence. And it is an insult to our intelligence and an insult to every single one of us that's forced to participate in this disgusting system.
Indeed. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for tonight. Huge thanks to our panel. Davon Love, Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Amanda Yee, host of the China Report and also editor of Liberation News. Thank you for all of your insight and joining us here tonight on this special broadcast of Free Speech TV and Breakthrough News here tonight on the DNC. And just quickly before we close here, I just want to say to our listeners, you were only able to hear this fantastic commentary because this is independent news that's supported by people like you. So I want to ask everybody who's watching, if you go to freespeech.org, that's freespeech.org, that's the website of Free Speech TV, you'll see up in the top right-hand corner a little donate button. I want you to go to that button, donate. Hopefully, if you can, become a recurring donor and support Free Speech TV, who is helping to do so much to make this broadcast happen. And you can find us at patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. Don't just support one, support us all. Support us as much as you possibly can. I know it's a tough time, but that's how we're able to bring you really insightful programming from people you're not going to see on the mainstream news like Davon and Amanda. We will be back with you tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 9 p.m. We'll also have Katie Halper with us tomorrow, and we'll have Lawrence Grand Prix, also of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, with us. Great panel, great guest, a lot to look forward to. Breakthrough News, Free Speech TV, special coverage of the DNC. Signing off for now. We will see you tomorrow, August 22nd, to continue our conversation.